Awesome. Thank you, Renee. And thanks as always, Morgan, for the reminder to record. All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Joel will drop the agenda in the chat in just a moment. And I wanted to, first and foremost, just kind of remind people about where we are at in the process and give people kind of insight into what happened at the last meeting for those that were not able to attend, and it has been a little while. Just know that both the agenda and meeting summary can be found on our public drive, and Joel will have both of those linked in the chat in just a moment. So as a refresher, the last time that we met as a full subcommittee was in July. And we heard from our guest speaker, Ernest House Jr., who is the Senior Policy Director of Keystone Policy Center and is the former Executive Director for the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs. As you all may know, Catherine Redhorse is now the Executive Director who we work closely with on CCIA-related matters. But Ernest, we had the privilege of having him with us a couple of months ago, and he really gave us a historical review of tribes that have and do call Colorado home. You know, he talked about 46 other tribes that will always call Colorado home, and you know, that may not receive as much attention or that we may not know as much about, and really got into details about how to engage with local community and how to engage with Indigenous community members in particular, and kind of gave us some insights around both like the benefits and controversy around considering certain Indigenous populations and people who live on reservations, categorizing them into the definition of disproportionately impacted communities. So we had a really robust discussion. We also started to gear up for the CCIA meeting that happened in September. Well, I say it happened in September, like we're already out of September, but happened just last week on September 8th. So we met as a full subcommittee in July, and then some members that were particularly involved or wanted to participate in that CCIA meeting met separately in August to prepare for that meeting. And essentially what we talked about is, what the, PowerPoint would consist of, what we would be presenting out and what our general messaging would be about. So we successfully attended that meeting. And when I say we, Ian and Renee as our two task force representatives were able to present at the September CCIA meeting that took place in Durango. Ian is in person and Renee co-facilitated that presentation online. And so I wanted to just turn it over to them for a brief few minutes to kind of do a report back from that September 8th CCIA meeting. I know, Ian, you mentioned that you might be losing your voice. So if you have trouble kind of sharing out, that is totally fine. And feel free to drop anything in the chat, but I welcome both you and Renee to kind of share out about that meeting. Many of us CDPHE EJ program staff were on that call. And I will just say very high level, and yes, reflecting what Jamie just said in the chat, the presentation was excellent. And I think just Ian and Renee really represented the work of the task force really well. And so you should be proud to have had them as representatives at that meeting in Durango. But I will leave it at that, and Renee and Ian, feel free to share further.
Do you want to go first, Renee?
Go ahead and go, love, and I'll recap anything too.
Okay, so it was a really nice drive down there. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to go through everything on my way there. And yes, thank you for acknowledging I am losing my voice, although it's starting to sound a little better than how it was earlier today. A lot of talking. It was a wonderful experience to be able to go down there and to meet in person. It was at the Southern U Casino, and present there, Sheila Davis was also there in person because she's already a member of the commission itself. And the Southern Ute tribe members were there in person, the council members and the chairman virtually were the Ute Mountain Ute. I believe we were only scheduled for like 10 to 15 minutes. It felt like it went on for almost an hour, which I think was really a wonderful conclusion to the entire process. We kept the presentation short of our slides and really just tried to speak from our heart about how we got here. We told the story of the passage of the bill. We told the story about where we are. We acknowledged that they had been contacted before. We told them that we were committed to doing this work and why we formed this subcommittee in the first place and why we were present there today. I worked with Renee. We did take some medicine bundles to them, which they were very grateful for, and I think was a nice gesture. For best I heard from Catherine Redhorse and many of the other staff that we worked with over the last months to get to this point was that we really broke through to them. It turned into a rather robust dialogue with many questions from people from the commission directly. There was some tech issues in the beginning, and I understand it was also challenging for people virtually to hear fully. But what I can tell you is they were very engaged. Suggestions were made. Conversations were had even after our presentation was done. Interestingly, Rick Garcia, the executive director of the Department of Local Affairs, he had a fair amount of questions to ask, and I had reflected to him that DOLA had come up many times, and it was unfortunate that they weren't necessarily a part of the commission or part of the task force from the beginning. One thing of note that I think is really important is that in the beginning, I think that they were under the impression that it was really only about legacy pollution. And the Southern Ute in particular were saying, look, we don't have a lot of legacy pollution. The Ute Mountain Ute had raised concerns around legacy mining pollution, in particular uranium, and they talked a little bit about water access and their ability to access water fairly. But what I communicated and reflected back to them, that it's not only about understanding and trying to remediate harms from the past, but it's also about planning for the future and resources that are available and will be available to them. And I think at that point, they started to understand that there was a bigger picture here of what could be available to them. What was very clear to me is that I think they would like to see more consultation from different agencies, that yes, they believe that they do not have the resources to effectively participate in environmental hearings and even our task force, and they made requests for that. I think that's probably the most high level summary that I can give you. But like I said, I think it was a great omen that we started with them saying, we don't want to participate. And then we got our 15 minutes 3 months ago. And then to get this hour now, it was certainly the most discussed topic during the entire commission hearing because I stayed there.
Thank you, Ian. So grateful for you making the travels down there. I hope your throat heals. Osha and elderberry does work wonders. And then just to recap, I really hope that this is an opening to a reciprocal relationship, now knowing that there might be limited resources in that space. The Ute chairman did reach out to me personally, and I've been talking with him on the phone a couple times already. And it's recognizing that they do see the importance of the Environmental Justice Action Task Force as a form of representation and equity as well. Even inclusion on state and federal agencies, if that now, as Ian said, is the discussion in future sectors, and how to do it with equity analysis with Indigenous communities and tribal affiliated communities directly. I really appreciate bringing, and thank you, Ian, again, for bringing medicine bundles. I was always told, especially if you're going into someone else's home, don't show up empty-handed. And these are especially chairmen, the people that are in charge of how their policies and rulemaking are going to be in their own communities as well. So being able to continue again, a reciprocal relationship directly with building that, with the Ute Mountain Ute chairman continuing going forward. He discussed issues in Utah that the Environmental Justice Action Task Force could have resources to just give information to establish some type of equity analysis or subcommittees there as well, through their state and federal agencies, understanding definitions here, best practices outreach. And this just shows you how this task force is rooting in a much bigger picture as well too, that there's other issues in other spaces, that it's going to be similar when we're working with community to industry, and what does it really look like to look at it in the ability for communities to not only have to deal with legacy pollution, but to realize that the resources for future generations are also limited, and recognizing balance and equity within that space is their survivance and respect to their communities as well. So being really mindful about moving forward with communities with that same reciprocity. I'm always down to help. I'm sorry I couldn't join in person this time. And I really hope that I can in the future, in a way that we continue this, not just discussions, but complete equitable inclusions of these communities and our communities as well.
And for those who are wondering what the bundles were, they were sage, copal, tobacco, and cedar.
Each of those medicines, I could tell you what they are to my tribe's significance, if you're ever interested.
Thanks, Ian and Renee, and Sheila, please, considering you were at the meeting as well, I would be happy to hear your reflections.
Yeah, so just to add to Ian and Renee's, their amazing summaries, this is such an opportunity, and so it needs to be nurtured, this relationship with tender, loving care, is my takeaway from this. And I'm concerned because after November, I'm not sure how things will shake out, but I just hope that this continues to be nurtured.
Sheila, I wonder if I could jump in there. I mean, obviously the task force wraps up its work in November, but we in the EJ program will keep coming to work every day, and obviously really want to keep working closely with Rachel and Rod and Kimberly and your staff to sort of coordinate on issues of EJ that are important to the tribal governments. I know I added multiple issues or topics that we should follow up with Rachel on, including that White Mesa uranium mill question that in Utah that Renee brought up earlier, to kind of see what, if anything, we as staff can do to kind of follow up on that question that came from the Ute Mountain Ute tribal chairperson. And then just a open-ended reminder that though this task force wraps up its work in November, the Environmental Justice Advisory Board will continue in perpetuity, and in that board, obviously relationships are critical, and it's different people who were not involved in this first relationship building, but hopefully we can think about ways that advisory board can kind of continue the work to the extent it's really more appropriate for like a board like this organization to be doing it as opposed to us as staff. So I think we can definitely think about ways to like continue the discussion, and just I'm so grateful, I guess I'll just say as staff, to the task force members who have helped open this door with the tribal governments by being there for the CCIA meetings.
If I could just ask, so the board will be doing more than granting. I mean, I thought that primarily that would be the focus, but if it's going to, will they have other responsibilities? It sounds like they might. Okay.
Yeah, so the advisory board really has 4 responsibilities, but I think that including grant making, I think the really relevant one in this context is that they can respond to requests for basically policy advice on environmental justice topics that are referred either by us at CDPHE or by the governor's office. So they have been doing that. We just had a work group meeting last night on a policy question related to carbon capture, use, and sequestration that's been referred to them. So they've been hard at work setting up their grant program, because that's a huge lift to do in a year. And of course, the task force has been tackling a ton of policy topics. So I feel like most policy topics have really come here to the task force instead of going to the advisory board so far. But obviously, once the task force wraps up its work, that will probably be a growing portfolio of the work the advisory board does.
I'm just going to jump in there and say that from my conversations this goes beyond the scope of just CDPHE and the agency and the scope of CDPHE, and just like our task force does. And so I think when we come back to the importance of bolstering tribal liaisons in different agencies, I think that is directly connected to it. I also want to say that though the task force may be ending and making the recommendations, I personally feel an obligation, and I hope others do, to take it on the road and to have conversations with communities about what is in it, and including in continuing to engage the tribes in the importance of it. And then lastly, as we've just discussed, the possibility of some sort of interagency working group that would be working to implement whatever recommendations are. A recommendation that has crossed my mind on the drive back was perhaps that should be mirrored with some sort of community-based board as well, that is working alongside, that can bridge that conversation between community and state employees, and is bringing a more robust perspective than solely CDPHE scope of work.
Thanks, Ian. Any others have comments or questions on kind of the CCIA meeting and the relationships that we've been discussing here before we jump into the recommendations document? Okay, so hearing none, we are going to go ahead and move on to our next section of the agenda, which is focusing on the Indigenous Community Engagement recommendations. And so I just want you all to keep in mind that these are recommendations to date. The latest feedback that we received was actually just today from Rachel Bryant Ocker, who's CDPHE's tribal liaison. She's been with us several times during this meeting. And then as well, we got some feedback from Kimberly Blackhorse and Gerard Cozy as well, who are our tribal data health specialists and analysts respectively. And so we've incorporated their changes into this draft that you all are looking at. We've dropped a link to the draft in the chat. So if you want to follow along on your own screen, feel free to do so. Some people kind of like scrolling on their own time. And then otherwise, we will be sharing the draft recommendations on the screen.
Before we jump in there really quick, I just thought of one other thing that was presented at the meeting, and that was the History Colorado had presented a history of boarding schools. And I think that it would be really interesting if we would also include that in our report alongside the histories we have of the urban centers as well. I think it's an important narrative for people to understand as they're reading through both a history of Colorado and then how it relates to now.
That's a really good idea. I'm sorry, I just needed to add, because we need to establish urban indigenous as well, and the multimodal community that mobile community that indigenous communities are. Most don't even know Denver was a relocation city, and that does directly relate still now to equity. Sorry, I just wanted to add more.
No, I would agree. I think we have brought that recommendation several times, either as part of like the initial opening of it, as we're like setting the tone for this conversation. And then also, I think we have brought it up in this committee to include the history of it. I think we had even mentioned reaching out maybe to the universities to add that information, or to provide that sort of an appendix to the recommendations from our subcommittee.
And just so I'm getting that clearly, so the suggestion is to kind of like add like an introductory section that talks about like the history of boarding schools and the history of like tribal nations in Colorado as kind of a precursor to the recommendations.
I was gonna type it, but never mind. I was gonna say something that
Yeah.
gives context of Indigenous identity with historical context all the way up until now to the modern identity.
Yes, and I think we have mentioned also for the general task force that we wanted to include not just Indigenous communities, but like history or historical context of disproportionately impacted communities. I think once we finalize the real definition, because I think we're still pending the definition, but that we wanted to elevate the history of like why did it get those, like why those communities became disproportionately impacted communities, especially the ones with racial context.
Great. Sheila?
Another related to the conversation about the boarding schools is a topic of truth and reconciliation. And I don't know what the appetite is for that. And if this is something, I mean, I kind of feel like this task force is the beginning of that process. But I mean, it isn't, because our, you know, our scope is wider than the impact, you know, disproportionately impacted communities. I mean, we, you know, there are many. And anyway, I'm just mentioning that. Well, anyway, I kind of think that truth and reconciliation might be a great way to address a lot of this environmental harm across so many communities, but that's another, I don't know, that's a big subject.
I think this can add a layer, and especially that baseline of context. And when you're starting with Indigenous communities, and when we go directly to land use and the issues that we're talking about now, that is missing for the type of sensitivity when we're talking about cultural sensitivity and trauma sensitivity in equity.
I am sorry, I feel like I'm not capturing this well. So maybe Sheila and Renee both, are you kind of, I think what I was hearing like Renee and Ilda say is maybe a suggestion to add like some like background information on historical context at the start of this section. Is that right? And are you kind of giving feedback on what should be like included in there, or did you have like an idea about a standalone recommendation? I wasn't sure, kind of both Sheila and Renee, what you were thinking on that.
I think, as Ian and Hilda have mentioned before, being able to establish some type of historical context of, let's say, Colorado as a founding state alone, starting with Indigenous communities, and knowing that type of context, all including the Relocation Act, including many things that influence how populations have ebbed and flowed to eventually create where we are kind of are now, because there's legitimately data gaps there. And if we don't provide this form of historical context and sensitivity, we're not going to be able to look at equity and best practices with the respect that these communities also deserve through traumas and different things still going on. Did that help? I don't know, sorry.
I think it did. I think I hear you say that those are things that we should sort of provide in like the intro section of this component of the task force recommendations to provide that context. So that's helpful. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't like a separate standalone recommendation you were talking about.
Yeah, but my comment was that it should not only be to this subcommittee, like the historical context of Indigenous communities. There is so much historical context of the Chicano movement in Colorado, like so many pieces that add up to that historical context of other communities that should be integrated into our kind of either executive summary or opening piece, as we're talking about like why these communities have been historically disproportionately impacted in Colorado, like sort of the being able to add the why.
Thanks, Hilda, for that added detail. And I think that's helpful to just like have an introductory like framing going into the task force recommendations. So we will definitely work on that and try to see like how we can best kind of be holistic in that framing and ensure that we set it up for like an understanding of why we are providing the recommendations to begin with. Okay, so great. Thanks for kind of kicking us off with that that overall feedback on how to kind of introduce this topic of, you know, Indigenous community engagement into the draft recommendations overall. I think that's really helpful. I would like to kind of go about this in a pretty standard way in that we will go through each of these bullets, and I encourage conversation around each of them. We do have a couple of hours here. Intentionally, the meeting was set for 2.5 hours, and you know, I think that gives us plenty of time to talk through each of these. As you all can see, the document is just 1.5 pages, actually much shorter. I added some spacing between the bullets so that it would be easier for us to look at. But let's, you know, start off by talking about bullet 1, and we won't spend more than about like 5, maybe 10 minutes talking about each bullet. But if there is possible that a recommendation is like a-okay and sounds good and there's silence and we can move on to the next one, that is totally fine. It's also totally fine that we end early. If, you know, we don't end at 9, I'm sure nobody would complain about that. I also just, one thing I forgot to mention at the top of the hour, which is noted in the agenda, is that we do not have public comment, you know, parsed out in the agenda, but because this group is small and the way that we have been holding this subcommittee space in general, we welcome members of the public to participate in this process of shaping the recommendations actively. So this is kind of different from our other subcommittee meetings where we hold public comment to the end. If you are a member of the public and you feel strongly about a recommendation or wording about a recommendation, please drop your ideas in the chat or come off mute, raise your hand. So we'll go ahead and get started with the first bullet here, that all state agencies should have paid full-time tribal liaisons on their staff to facilitate formal government-to-government relationships with tribal nations, as well as provide guidance on engagement with other Indigenous populations. And I do want to note, I'll give folks a moment to kind of process that and think about it. I did just want to flag this comment. So Dominique will be joining us a bit later. She's busy taking care of her kids, but she just wanted to kind of flag this as a discussion point. She says, I would think that having 22 separate liaisons would cause confusion and not serve Indigenous communities particularly well, perhaps only liaisons for key agencies. So just food for thought, and I welcome discussion not only around Dominique's point, but around this recommendation in general. Ian.
I think we should ask people who do the job.
So I know that Rachel has looked at this and has not flagged this to be an issue. I also know that Kimberly and Gerard, who are on the call, work closely with Rachel, who is the designated tribal liaison of CDPHE. So I wonder, Kimberly and Gerard, if you have any thoughts here.
I mean, my first impression is I think Ian's completely right. I think those are the people that should be answering that question. My one concern is if we are going to limit it, you know, how do you decide between who gets a liaison, who doesn't? Like what standards, or, you know, what are we using as our sort of checks and balances of who is, and what sort of organization pattern we're going to do, because there will still be work that works with the tribes through agencies that don't have liaisons if we are limiting it.
Yeah, and just as like staff homework, we're happy to kind of you know, float this recommendation you know, by other tribal liaisons and see what they think and if there's additional detail that they would add. Any others have thoughts on this?
I guess I have I'm just wondering what would be the alternative if each agency didn't have tribal liaison.
I don't know if Sheila or Gerard or Kimberly can sort of speak to that, but I think in the status quo, the staff of the Colorado Commission on Indian Affairs sort of serves in that role to help coordinate tribal government relations with state government agencies for agencies that don't have a tribal liaison. Though because we are fortunate to be CDPHE that we do have a tribal liaison, I don't know exactly how that works. But my understanding is that role is generally filled by CCIA staff.
I think the way that I would look at it is could you imagine the United States not having an ambassador to another nation? How would those two nations interact?
Should I take that as you're inclined to support this recommendation?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool.
I don't know. I mean, I don't understand the justification for not having, I don't understand that one at all, for not having a full-time tribal liaison. So help, I mean, I just, it doesn't make any sense to me. So if someone can explain why that, why that, what the logic is behind that.
I'm not answering or supporting not having a full-time. I just want to see that perspective. So I think I'm driving, sorry, also pulled over. In terms of like an agency perspective, I don't know how other agencies operate. At CDOT, we definitely support there being a liaison, right? For us, it's kind of based on the fact that, we have an office in a region down in Durango, and we have, an executive leader who actually has that relationship and is engaged with CCIA. So that is a person, a staff member that we have that's not necessarily a full-time dedicated 100% to that relationship, right? But they are the main contact that identifies as our liaison for the agency. And so I think that explanation, I'm curious if that's going against or something that can be supported through this task, if that makes any sense. I could see how there's other staff in different agencies that may serve in that role, but it's not a full-time position for them. Is that something to be questioned or concerned about?
Well, my concern is that this position has to represent the interests of the tribal nations, and that has to be the #1 priority. And if this person is doing it part-time, I don't know, I could see some conflict of interest issues arising. If this is something, and you're going to be this, we're going to add this to your list of responsibilities. That is my concern, because our agencies are so rooted in white dominant culture.
So I'm hearing general support for the recommendation actually as it appears. And maybe we would want to get a little bit more specificity around kind of like just details that other tribal liaisons might want to include based on their perspective. But from what we've heard from this subcommittee and what I'm hearing kind of in the conversation today, is that this recommendation is generally supported. So with that said, and please stop me if you want to kind of talk about this further, but we can move on to the next one. And sorry, Sheila, I don't know if you had your hand up already or if you just put your hand up. Okay. All right, so moving on to our next recommendation. So state agency tribal liaisons should work to create avenues for tribal governments and Indigenous Coloradans to formally raise concerns about potentially harmful names of industrial facilities. Additionally, agencies should continue implementing practices such as the Public Utilities Commission's practice of referring to power plants by non-Indigenous names in short form. For example, replacing the name of a unit at a power plant that is named after a tribe, if done without the tribe's explicit consent, by instead referring to the city or county where the power plant is located. So one, we are talking about here the use of Indigenous language and tribal names when we are referring to industrial polluting facilities. This generally is a recommendation that received a lot of support. I do want to mention that this was actually put in the bike rack because it wasn't talked about for a little while, and it was made perfectly clear at the last meeting that this should be brought back to this document. So we've heard reiterated support on this multiple times. I do want to flag also Gerard's comment on this, which was pretty interesting and I thought could be a good area of conversation for us. He says, conversely, I think it's important that state agencies, when appropriate, use tribal names for places and areas alongside the non-Indigenous names provided. This could go even further in saying that state agencies, when possible, could add Indigenous translations. And the idea behind that is that it would promote language equality, and of course, only when this is possible. So, we're kind of looking at two sides of using, tribal names or, Indigenous language. And so I'll pause there and let folks kind of absorb that and see what folks have to say.
I support renaming and reclaiming that space completely. One, just specifically to be mindful about how that adds insult to injury to a lot of the communities that have been driven from their own spaces, and then to be named after pollution sources or industry sources, being mindful of these types of contexts. And then also including communities to come back and have restorative efforts or spaces that they can come back to their own land to reclaim and rename it that way too. What was it named before, if it's the resources, and being able to heal spaces and be a part as well of their own homelands, so that there can be some restorative efforts there from harm done.
Thanks, Renee. So I'm hearing your support of this recommendation and also support of what Gerard mentioned in the comment as well. The use, kind of finding the original name of a place or a land and making sure that that language is used. We'll go Velma, Ian, and then Ilda.
Hi. Sorry. I'm a little hoarse too. I was just going to say, I really support completely replacing the appropriated Indigenous names as a very important environmental justice measure. We and others out front in Pueblo, and also other renewable energy organizations in Pueblo have tried very hard to be consistent about not using the appropriated names. So I don't support a recommendation for a side-by-side. That just keeps the appropriation in place. And I don't think that unless there's explicit consent sought and granted, that Indigenous place names should be used to replace the names of tribes. It's the cultural appropriation that is oppressive about that practice. So I support the recommendation. I support the complete replacement of the names. Thanks.
I'll jump in here. Interestingly enough, in the two meetings that I attended in this last year with the CCIA, they were tasked with the responsibility of naming of schools and like other government buildings that were of inappropriate names. I also know there's like a renaming task force that exists for DNR. I might wonder if which space is the appropriate space for that. In the case of my understanding of all the industrial facilities that have those names, they were all specifically Xcel Energy plants. And so is this like an avenue that we would want to pursue through the PUC as a responsibility? Would we want to send it to the CCIA? The thing is, you know, I don't know what the appropriate place is, but it seems to me like consulting with the CCIA and or the other renaming commission that is working on lands issues may be the appropriate place to ask what the appropriate next steps would be. But and I could be wrong, but I really do believe it's just Xcel Energy facilities.
Thanks, Ian. And Yilda, go ahead. And as folks raise their hand, feel free to come off mute. You don't need to wait on me to call on you.
Actually, she just put my hand down. I think some of the pieces that I was going to say have been elevated. I think especially when referring to changing to a tribal name or a name used for an indigenous name, I think there should be a consultation with that group or that community previous to the naming of it. And I think that's just or a community engagement process in order to assure that the naming is appropriate. Maybe that's just sort of like an edit that I would like to make sure that's included.
Yeah, thanks, Yilda. And thanks, Ian, for providing that additional detail about kind of which specific agencies should be doing this. All right. Gerard, I know you were kind of in and out. I know you had some connectivity issues, but I do want to give you the opportunity if there was anything else that you wanted to share around this comment, if you would like to.
Sure. I suppose, and I'm not sure, like you said, I had some connectivity issues, so I wasn't sure if this was already said, but just as long as there's consultation and it's worked through with, you know, tribal members or indigenous peoples that, you know, were the original namers of these areas, like just to make sure that we're, you know, going with what they want.
Thank you. Jamie?
I'm in complete agreement with consulting with tribal governments and entities whenever anything impacts them. the one concern that kind of came up for me as as I was listening to this conversation is the public community was consulted when the idea of bringing a coal-powered plant called the misappropriately named, inappropriately named, just like we're talking about, to our community. And although our community was, and I know this isn't necessarily the tribal community associated with that name, but when our community was consulted, we weren't necessarily, the first thing on our mind wasn't necessarily the pollution that was going to be emitted from that plant. And the corporation and the people trying to sell the ideas certainly weren't about to say that, whether they were consulting with us or not. They weren't about us to tell us about those negative aspects of the plant. They were only going to talk it up, talk about the jobs, talk about the, you know, any positives, the energy being generated there, et cetera. And so when we talk about consultation, I'm not exactly sure how we enforce honesty, but you know, that I think that's just a concern for me. Like I say, I've seen it happen in my own community where we were sold an idea that didn't include really any of the negatives when it was being sold to us.
I don't
Appropriate. Rip. Sorry, Quo.
Sorry, Jaime, I thought you were done. Feel free.
I basically was done. I was just kind of correcting a minor something I said, but it's not a big deal. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's too bad Michael Sapp's not here, and I'm wondering if even Excel Energy would commit to doing that without having to create a whole bureaucratic system to do that. I've read stories in the Colorado Sun about concerns around transmission line right away adjacent to the Sand Creek Massacre site, and it sounds like they came to a good space there with the tribal nations, of course, that are actually, their reservations are in Wyoming, and so I don't necessarily think a directive to the PUC is a bad thing. I'm just curious if they might be open to that on their own. Maybe we can ask Michael.
Thanks, Ian. And I'll just reiterate Lumna's thanks. I mean, I think, you know, we've said this a lot, and kind of the framing of where we're at in the process, but that type of nitty gritty detail of like, okay, who is going to do this is really critical at this point, right? So I just really appreciate you raising, like, is it the PUC? Is it the CCIA? Is it something Excel would commit to voluntarily? So thank you for getting into that detail.
Yeah, Velma.
I would just like to throw in there that I think in some form having a naming recommendation both for state entities and private industry would still be a good type of recommendation to have in the final document. For instance, a recommendation on not using recognized names without consultation or something like that. And possibly in addition to the recommendation for renaming. But even, I'm just thinking, even if Excel would agree to rename all their facilities, somebody else could come along in the future and that would benefit from such guidance.
Yeah,
I think that's a good point, Velma.
Yes, agreed. And we can possibly clarify the language to reflect that. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and move us on to the next recommendation. So agencies should continue to acknowledge the tribal nations that historically inhabited Colorado during appropriate times, like the beginning of public meetings. And when doing so, agencies should consider going beyond land acknowledgements by using tools like the Native Governance Center's Beyond Land Acknowledgement Guide. If you're able to click on that document, it kind of provides tips on what you can do besides just providing a land acknowledgement at the start of a meeting. So any conversation or dialogue around this recommendation? And I just want to be clear, as we're talking about these recommendations, folks don't need to feel pressure to say, I support this recommendation. I think that is almost like the given, like you as task force members created these recommendations. We didn't write these, you wrote them, or at least you said them out loud during a meeting and we kind of helped craft them. So these are ideas that come from you. What we're trying to do at this point is further refine, add more details, or if there's any opposition, perhaps one task force member mentioned this and we put it in, but the majority of you feel otherwise. That's the type of feedback that we're looking for. So further details or kind of if you would like anything taken out or adjusted.
Well, I'm in full support of continuing the practice. I think that we've heard so much from Renee over the years about erasure, and the importance of that conversation, I think, is critically important. I'm not so familiar with the guide, so I'm gonna have to like click through that.
Yep, and I wish I could remember exactly who provided us with this. And Kimberly, it might have been you. Sorry if I don't remember exactly. There's been, Joel, do you remember?
It was Rachel Bryan Alker, our tribal liaison.
Yeah, but
Then I'm
folks,
inclined to agree.
yeah, and I've read through the document and, personally do think it's a really great resource guide as somebody who is non-Indigenous. Okay, moving on to our next recommendation. Agencies should improve engagement with Indigenous populations by establishing positive allyship through active collaboration and listening to the concerns and goals of Indigenous communities. Agencies should understand the intent for engaging by utilizing cultural humility. Agency staff should educate themselves about the historical context for the current relationship between federal and state governments and tribal governments before taking action. And then some more specific recommendations. They should work closely with the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs and engage in best practices for tribal engagement. They should also familiarize themselves with the state tribal consultation guide, particularly section 4 that provides tips and steps for successful tribal consultation. And I will just say that these last two recommendations were most recently added by Rachel Bryan Alker and Kimberly Blackhorse, who are on with us today. So I welcome any thoughts or feedback on this, and we'll just pause for a moment. I know I just read through 5 sentences, so I welcome the silence and time for people to reflect.
I like it, but I feel like there should be some type of implementation or hold some type of accountability where it says agencies should understand the intent for engaging by utilizing cultural humility. It's to eventually analyze with hopefully a decolonial lens equity. what does that look like now to analyze where there's been a loss of use of land use and now resources now or sources now? And how do also those governments, tribal governments also want to conduct that with that form of sensitivity too? Did that make sense? So some type of accountability and some type of implementation to where these just aren't broad concepts of cultural humility, but there's an actual cognitive bridging of how to actually act in that way.
Renee, I'm just going to push a little bit further. Is there, your idea is noted. Is there any like language in particular that you would like to introduce into the sentence?
I always try to be mindful of trauma sensitivity, where communities are already dealing with forms of pollution or harmful socioeconomic barriers, where they're not able to meet now, and how can you conduct yourself to where, as always, don't make them constantly have to repeat the same story over and over again, but move with an awareness of meeting them where they're at. And also a self-reflective thing too, going into the process.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I do want to, and maybe this is just because it's fresh in my mind, but that the Beyond Land Acknowledgement Guide that is in the previous recommendation does focus a lot on self-reflection, and that recommendation is directed towards agencies. So I think that touches on that as well. We'll go Ian, and I know Velma, you had your hand up for a second, and feel free to come off mute after Ian.
This is connected to the conversations that we've had in the past about undercounting of indigenous populations, and particularly in urban centers, and how that often is reflected in less resources being available for serving those communities. And I'm wondering if this is a position where, not when you talk about follow through, Renee, it's like, how can we make resources available to community connectors? How can we make resources available for indigenous groups to be able to participate in rulemakings, etc. I don't know. I don't want to limit it too much, because I know when you really narrow grants or you narrow opportunities, sometimes they go unfulfilled. But I feel like there's some level of accountability there, Renee, that I'm hearing you talking about. And in particular, your organization is an example of a group that effectively does this. Like, I consistently enjoy going to community events with hundreds of tribal or indigenous peoples, and it is a powerful experience to take you from feeling alone in a system that undercounts you and undervalues you.
We're trying to have a container of a safe and brave space for communities to now engage with equity, but we also have to navigate with cultural and trauma sensitivity of meeting communities at where they're at, given the context of everything going on, especially historical and current environmental harms. Thank you, Ian, and well said too.
Thanks, Ian and Renee, and I'm seeing support from Velma. Any other thoughts around this recommendation? Seeing support from Ilda. Okay. So those points of feedback are noted. Thank you both. All right, we're going to move on to our next recommendation. Bear with me here. I'm not going to read through this entire bullet, because there are several sub bullets underneath it, but I'll go through each sub bullet one by one. And sorry, Velma, is there something that we did not capture that you wanted to flag?
No, I was just following up on Ian and Renee's comments just a minute ago.
Yep, and as always, Renee or Joel is taking kind of like high-level major takeaways in the margin comments, and then Morgan is taking more detailed notes in our notes document. And our notes document can be found in the public drive as well. And just keep in mind that like we as staff, we go back and we read through both of these. We often listen to the recording, look at the notes, look at the margin comments all together, and then that's how we update the recommendations. So fingers crossed we will not miss anything. Okay, moving on to our next recommendation. Agencies should use innovative strategies for engaging with urban indigenous populations and formal sovereignty affirming strategies for engaging with tribal governments. And this first sub-bullet says the use and sharing of data should be guided by community perspectives and priorities and honor tribal data sovereignty. State agencies should follow specific guidelines for the Urban Indian Health Institute or any future guidelines put forth by the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs when collecting data on urban American Indian, Alaska Native populations. When tribal governments provide specific guidelines and principles for working with tribal members, for example, the Navajo Nation Human Research Review Board, these tribal specific guidelines should be followed. And I'll give folks a moment to pause. This recommendation comes out of the most recent meeting that we had in July, and we got kind of more specific feedback from Kimberly and Gerard and Rachel on specific language to use here. So I think this is pretty refined, but I welcome any feedback, any additions that folks might want to add on here. And I'll pause for a minute, and if we don't hear any, I'll move on to the next sub-bullet. All right, I'm interpreting the silence as support for this recommendation, and I'm moving on to the next sub-bullet. So agencies should privilege Indigenous knowledge, lived experience, and ways of knowing and doing by utilizing Indigenous research methodologies, for example, talking circles. Renee.
I think we should also use forms of qualitative data, whether it's video testimonials, understanding storytelling, things like that. If the tribes are comfortable with recording or disclosing also, so being mindful again with that form of cultural sensitivity. Those are forms of qualitative data. Some of our storytelling also is representation of our living sciences as well. So being mindful of that, but also not exploiting it, appropriating it, misrepresenting it, or harming that type of narrative or hijacking it in any way that could be harmful again to tribes.
Thanks, Renee. Noted. Velma?
Finding the right buttons to push here. I just it's possibly built into this. So if I'm being duplicative, then I apologize. But there are fields and organizations related to science, Indigenous based science and data. And there's, I think probably folks know that there are fields of data sovereignty. And am I breaking up? I'm having a little internet instability.
Yeah, I think somebody was just off mute, but I think it looks like everybody's muted now. So go ahead, Velma.
Okay, so I was just going to say, I think a lot of times when agencies and other organizations, primarily based in white dominant culture, write about Indigenous knowledge and data. In addition to the vital importance of having communication with the people in the impacted communities. I think it's really important to remember that and to try and incorporate in some way the indigenous-based sciences and data sovereignty. For instance, I was just trying to share somewhat unsuccessfully an upcoming web seminar that was posted on the North Central Climate Adaptation, it's a long name, Science Center Facebook page about climate responses based on Lakota knowledge and science. And if I can figure out how to share that link, I will try and do so. But I just think a lot of times, while it's important to hear the community voices, it's also important not to forget that there's indigenous-based science out there that all too often gets completely ignored.
Yep, definitely. And I think a number of these sub-recommendations speak to that. Sheila.
So I like the language. My concern is, how will this be enforced? Because agencies, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but they're so rooted in Western ways of knowing. And so this is like 180 degrees. And so what, to actually privilege indigenous knowledge. And so I just don't want it to get lost in the shuffle, because it will be so easy for the agencies to go back to the status quo. And I don't know what kind of accountability language could be added.
Any others have thoughts on Sheila's point there about like including accountability language? If not in these sub bullets, maybe in the introductory bullet of like, how these recommendations should be implemented.
Community modeling or monitoring, some form of where communities consistently engaged throughout the process and able to help model what that looks like. Velma put a few examples too. Thank you, Sheila. That's a very good point. Thank you, Velma.
Thanks, Velma. And I encourage folks to kind of, think about Sheila's point about, implementation and accountability language that we can further include. I'm going to move on to the next sub bullet and let's keep thinking about that. So agencies should continuously and actively reach out to urban indigenous organizations. A first step would be to formally ask for an introductory meeting and then attend a public forum or open listening session to learn more about the indigenous community. This provides insight into the urban indigenous community and would provide knowledge about their concerns and goals. Any additional feedback on this recommendation? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next.
Renee, do you have feedback here? Because I think that given you're the type of organization that they would be engaging with.
Yes, in this space, honestly, reconnect and connect with those already doing the work. As in all honesty, there's a lot of communities that have been upholding themselves for a very long time. And going to those communities, going where there might be burdens, Native American Housing Committee is one, but then so many others, even in the Indigenous Chicano space as well. And it's going to spaces to learn and be reciprocal with cultural sensitivity, and then help communities, and especially urban spaces, learn how they've adapted to the status quo that has left them out, whether it's in healthcare, cultural identity, education, and many other forms, and relearning there too. That also puts the onus on state and federal agencies to, again, meet communities at where they're at and start funding those that have been long doing this work for a form of equity.
Thanks, Renee. And I'm hearing in your comment, support for this bullet.
Yes, and as always, accountability and implementation, a timeline that's going to get in action.
Mhm. Right. I'm going to move us on to the last sub-bullet of this section. So ask permission to respectfully attend and conduct outreach at Indigenous events from organizers and urban Indigenous organizations. For example, it may not be appropriate to perform outreach at a particular powwow event, events, and would be important to match themes with specific events. If an event is organized by a tribal government, it would be important to take the necessary steps to affirm the government-to-government relationship with the tribal government. For example, agency staff should not cold email a tribal chairperson or the director of a tribal government program, but instead should work through appropriate channels such as the agency's tribal liaison or the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs.
In Lumna, I think in the spirit of what we've been doing, I'm kind of sharing the origin of things. If I'm remembering correctly, these are some of the first ideas the subcommittee came up with. I think they were a discussion in the very first subcommittee meetings. They've kind of been in the draft recommendations and evolved over time. I think kind of some of the specificity here in the second sub bullet comes from thoughts that, if I'm remembering correctly, Gerard shared on the last draft of kind of ensuring that the sort of invitation to conduct outreach at Indigenous events is sort of conducted in a respectful and appropriate way. So I don't know, Gerard, if you want to add any gloss on that or additional comments, but just kind of grounding us in how we got to the words that are currently on the page.
Nothing offhand, but I'm not sure if Gerard mentioned or not, but
Oh, Hilda, I think
support
you're.
the idea of pursuing these relationship building opportunities outside of just pushing an agenda. For instance, we talked about the powwow, and just recently I had the pleasure of going to this Southern Ute Indian tribe powwow with no agenda in mind, but just realistically just to be there and enjoy the experience.
I'm sorry, is it just me or was that a little hard of hearing on that one?
Yeah, it was a little quiet, but I think Joel captured that pretty well. And I think the emphasis that Gerard was placing was on like relationship building and not necessarily, attending these events or, doing outreach with a, always a specific purpose in mind, but really focusing on the relationships. And Gerard, please feel free to correct me or elaborate if I'm wrong. And I don't know if there's a way for you to put the speaker closer to you, but I think some folks had a hard time hearing you. All right, it looks like my summary was sufficient, so thanks for putting that in the chat. And I think definitely a good thing to acknowledge and consider. Any other feedback around this? And Ilda, I saw you come off mute for a second. I wasn't sure if you were trying to participate or if that might have been an accident.
Sorry, an accident.
No worries. Any other feedback on this recommendation? Okay, I'm not hearing any, so let's move on to our next one. In future legislation, the legislature should consider distinguishing between outreach and engagement requirements for federally recognized tribes and indigenous populations more broadly. Federally recognized tribes have sovereignty rights, and there are specific protocols that should be followed to ensure the appropriate government-to-government relationship with tribal governments. And Dominique, I saw that you just joined, and I also did not acknowledge the comment that Dominique provided prior to hopping on the call, but Dominique mentions in the comment, should we provide guidance that clarifies when and how to interact through CCIA? And Dominique, we're just going over this bullet point and just looking for further elaboration or any other commentary, and not to put you on the spot, but feel free to elaborate on that point. I know
Good
you
timing. Apologies
Right.
for being late. This is as early as I could jump on this evening. So yes, I just am sorry, not having known what has been said this evening, but I know that in my experience at the Energy Office, we want to be very careful to follow appropriate government to government guidelines, and it's not always 100% clear to us what that means. And so just thinking that if we are going to create kind of a best practice for engagement, we should be clear when we should be going through CCIA. And I don't know if that's something that already exists that I'm just not aware of. But especially as we're suggesting more engagement, which I love that idea, we should also try to provide some helpful hints on what appropriate engagement looks like, because I don't think it's always clear.
Any others have thoughts? And Kimberly and Gerard, always welcome your input, as I know that you both work closely with CCIA as well.
I think also using the state tribal consultation guide, which is the introduction Colorado state agency to conduct formal consultations with federally recognized American Indian tribes, lays it all out through introductions, with tribal sovereignty, a meaningful tribal consultation. It also states current state tribal consultation agreements within the Colorado, and steps for consultation and successful consultations. So I would suggest looking through that. And it also has frequently asked questions. It was a document that was produced by the Colorado Commission of Indian Affairs. It was introduced by Ernest House Jr., who was our speaker last meeting in July. So I'd suggest to read that document because it goes thoroughly through what I think Dominique's question was.
Yeah, thanks, Kimberly. And just so folks know, that document, the State Tribal Consultation Guide, is what is mentioned in a comment earlier. You'll see it kind of towards the bottom of page 1. And so I'm seeing some through lines here of there being overlap in incorporating that guide as a resource into this recommendation as well. And Gerard, pointed out the fact this goes back to having a liaison for every agency, to to ensure that that outreach and engagement is done appropriately. Dominique, I saw you come off mute for a second. Did you want to elaborate on anything further?
No, I just saw that comment and I saw that people kind of discussed my earlier comment about each agency having a liaison. And I guess I wanted to clarify with that. I think if there is a point person for each agency, that's a little bit different than having one full-time tribal liaison. And this is coming from an agency that's fairly small. I'm representing an agency that's very small. There are several agencies at the state that are like 30 or fewer people. And so I guess I'm wondering, I think it certainly makes sense to have a point person and a liaison, but a full-time liaison for a really small agency may not make sense in my mind. That was my thinking. And certainly curious about other people's thoughts on that, but that's my thought.
So I appreciate the question around smaller agencies. CDPHE, I think we're 2,000 and growing. But my concern is that somebody who might be half-time, the conflict of interest issues might come up, because I think the tribal liaison has to represent the tribes. That is the first priority, not the agency. And if this person is part-time liaison, part-time, I don't know, statistician, I can see some conflict of interest problems. Yeah.
I guess it's also just a question of how much each agency's work could better serve or better interact with a tribe. In my mind, some agencies will have more direct work with the tribe than others. I don't know. I guess, you know, in my experience, and yes, CDPHE, 2,000 people, it's very different from a few agencies have like 11 staff members. And so thinking about how to ensure that there is adequate and no conflict of interest, but also that that person would have a clear role. I'm just struggling to think about if that is something that makes sense in every single agency. I mean, if you have an agency where there's only 10 staff members, as I know there is of one, is there enough that that agency would have to have a full-time staff member that's a liaison? I don't know.
Well, it seems to me, if this agency has never prioritized the interests of the tribes, that there would be, you know, an enormous amount of work to do.
I would agree with you there, Sheila. And I also think like, wouldn't having, and you weren't on the call earlier when we were talking about this, Dominique, but we were asking folks that do that type of work, it opens up the pathway for there to be considerable more collaboration than it was ever perhaps thought possible before.
I guess I leave it to, I would love feedback, you know, from folks that work more closely with tribes, if they feel that there are the resources on the other side and the interest on the other side. I just know that it's also a lot to have 22 different full-time people asking for feedback or, you know, interacting. And so just want to make sure that that is not too much. if
You know-
there is interest on the other side, I certainly am open to the idea. I would just want to make sure that that is coordinated and not overburdening. And, you know, so I
hear
don't know. I do know that there's some agencies that are very different than CDOT and CDPHE in terms of how much work that they're doing that might be as relevant.
Well, one of the things that we learned, one of the recommendations that came out from the presentation at CCIA is that they very much would like more resources so that they could more effectively engage. I would agree with you that if you were to set it up and be one-sided and then not help support the ability for them to bolster their ability to interact, it would perhaps be cumbersome, but I think they have to be paired together.
Okay. Yeah, I think it is a great leap forward coming from an agency that didn't even have an outreach person until this year. You know, I think that I would love to get there. And I would love to see how we can make sure that we would fully support on the state side those liaisons. So, but maybe that's something that's already been kind of discussed, and make sure that they are coordinating with each other. Because I know in our outreach with DI communities already, there's not always a lot of coordination from different agency staff, and so we just want to make sure that that's coordinated and effective.
That feedback, I think, reflects the larger goal that we had talked about of some sort of interagency body that helps do that kind of coordination that you're talking about. So I wanted to point that out for the staff, as like I see that as bolstering a recommendation that isn't necessarily reflective of this subcommittee.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And I just want to also highlight Gerard's comment in the chat in case folks missed it, but you know, emphasizing that while we're talking about the tribal liaisons, you know, liaising with the tribes, we also need to remember that the tribal liaisons are working with our urban indigenous communities. And so that's, you know, when we're talking about community engagement, you know, we're not only talking about that government to government relationship, but talking about how to better engage indigenous populations in general. So all good points. Any further thoughts here? Or do folks, you know, feel okay with this recommendation? And I think one of the clear next steps for us as staff is maybe getting a little bit more specificity. And this goes back to Ian's like very initial comment about, hey, you know, we need to be talking to people that actually do this work, you know, sharing this recommendation with tribal liaisons and seeing if they have input or more specificity around this recommendation. And I've heard kind of here and there that maybe we could provide a little bit more specificity around size, like, you know, not only a size of an agency being too small, but a very large agency like CDPHE where there's only, you know, one tribal liaison, like, do we need more than one? So I think those are questions that we can take to the tribal liaisons themselves and get input from them in the form of public comment. All right, so this, I want to go back to the bullet that we were on and just ensure that we are in a good place to move on to our very last bullet. Was there any further commentary there? Okay. All right, so this final bullet, all arms of the Colorado state government should continue respecting the sovereign rights of the Ute Mountain Ute and Southern Ute Indian tribal governments while working in equal partnership with the tribal governments. Any further elaborations there?
I almost feel like that's like the first statement, and then so much of the other stuff comes after it.
Yeah, that I agree with that.
So moving this to the top, is that what I'm hearing? Kind of, is this like an initial recommendation and then, or is that where you're getting at, Ian?
Yeah, like, right, like I read that as like, that's like an opening statement, and like, this is how you can do it. I also feel like there is something else here that has to do with like the tribes that are still connected and still participating, like in that example I said earlier about the transmission lines with the Arapaho and the Cheyenne, right? Like there is something that extends beyond here of the people's spiritual, their history, all of it is still tied here somehow. And I don't know how that gets reworked, but I do think there should be encouragement, because I recently participated on a Parks and Wildlife task force for the new state park, and they hadn't connected with the Hickory Apache, and they were finding Hickory Apache artifacts there, right? And so is there a way to like finesse this to like encourage them to make connections to others that have that historical legacy? I mean, History Colorado does it. I think I've seen some agencies do it. And again, I'm not here to wordsmith it, but I love this at the beginning. And maybe there's also some acknowledgement to some of those other things that are, when appropriate, engaging tribes outside, like even Comanche as an example, right? Like they're in Oklahoma. So that's where their reservation is. So if we were going to talk about renaming Comanche or Arapaho plant, right? Like those issues transcend just the Ute nations that are within our boundaries.
Thanks, Ian. So hearing kind of moving this to the top of the recommendations and maybe elaborating on the tribal governments and having this extend beyond just those two mentioned tribes. Thanks for
Yes,
that.
I agree with that. I think, yeah, I think Ian makes a great point. There are a lot of tribal communities that aren't necessarily recognized by Colorado government, but that doesn't necessarily mean they shouldn't also be respected and have their sovereignty respected, et cetera. So yeah, I agree 100%.
Awesome, thank you. As we are wrapping this up, I do want to kind of take a moment and just reflect on all of the recommendations and see if there's any kind of high level feedback that you all have regarding these recommendations on, you know, additional input that you did not see that you want reflected, you know, or, you know, just and any general feedback on what else could be included.
For me, I think the most important thing we can do at this moment is to convey these newer recommendations to the tribal nations and any indigenous urban groups that are serving the community, like as soon as possible.
I concur with that.
Awesome. So I think us as your staff, what we've kind of noted in terms of next steps is polishing these recommendations, incorporating the feedback that we've heard today, you know, doing a little bit of reordering, doing some kind of introductory paragraphs that not only are introductory to this section, but to the task force recommendations in general. And then sending that kind of more polished version to CCIA for feedback, as well as the two federally recognized tribes that Ian and Renee and Sheila have kind of been helping us build a relationship with over the past few weeks. And so those are my thoughts on next steps. Any other feedback for us in terms of homework for staff?
I'm wondering if like Catherine Red Horse might have a more complete list again of like NGOs that are serving the communities. Like I know that Denver, for example, has an Indian commission, right? Like I'm just trying to think of how we can get it to them.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. And that's definitely a request that we can put in as we pass this on to CCIA to see if they can kind of continue to push this out in the form of public comment and see if there are other organizations they can pass it along to. And I think it would be kind of meaningful for it to come from CCIA. So it's a great suggestion. Any other feedback?
My closing thoughts are just, this is great. This meeting felt really good. Sometimes these meetings don't feel like they're going into such a groove, and this one definitely did today. So thanks to the staff for all your support. And that goes beyond just the EJ staff, but the other staff members from the government who are committing themselves on the weekday night, and to the community for participating. I see some people who didn't jump in, but just know when we have these meetings, we really do welcome your feedback, and you can still do it in writing.
Yeah, thank you. Agreed. I think this is a super productive meeting. I'm glad that we were able to get through all the recommendations, and we have 48 minutes to spare. So it's always a good feeling to have such an efficient meeting that we're able to end early. I don't want to, belabor this anymore, but I do just want to give members of the public, I know that we said that we don't have a public comment period, but if there are members of the public, just in the spirit of having public comment, if there's anybody that has any comments that they'd like to share, or if you want to come off mute just to say hi, we welcome that. Yeah, Velma.
Hey, I don't necessarily want to go first ahead of other community people because I've spoken several times. I just kind of wanted to get in line, but I wanted to kind of reinforce the somewhat brief commentary at the beginning of the meeting about the importance of uranium milling and mining waste as an environmental justice issue, both for Indigenous communities and other disproportionately impacted communities. There are multiple ways in which the uranium and nuclear industry life cycles are impacting environmental justice communities right now. And that includes multiple waste sites here in Colorado, some of which are very close to the Southern Ute lands. And there's the fact that the nuclear power industry is targeting low income and or communities of color, as well as Indigenous tribal lands for promotion of untested and really undeveloped nuclear power projects. So at any rate, I think that's an important topic, and one that has both legacy and ongoing implications for Indigenous communities as well as other environmental justice communities. And I think it's something that, as the environmental justice program and board goes forward, it should be, really like to encourage it to be kept on if not the front burner, a hot burner. So, and I'm going to put an article in the chat from environmental health perspectives last year that may be of interest.
Thank you. And always appreciate your perspectives and insights during your public comment periods. And thanks for the resources. In Katara, I did see from you in the chat, we know that you have been very active in this subcommittee and have contributed to the recommendations, both here in the meetings and through public comment. And thanks, Marina, for attending as well. So thank you all again for such a productive meeting. I will say, you know, we do need to recognize that some of the other meetings coming up will be a little bit more complex. You know, they are a bit longer, but we know that we are reaching the finish line. We are less than 2 months away from our deadline of November 14th, which is why we are holding so many meetings. So just a reminder, I know that many of you saw all these calendar invitations come in, and you know, I know that probably was a little overwhelming, but we did talk about this at our August meeting in Grand Junction, that we, you know, this is kind of the final run through of all of these subcommittee meetings. We're hoping to do a lot of the legwork so we can get to the October meeting and feel like we're in a really good place to, you know, start to put the final touches on the recommendations. So that said, our next subcommittee meeting taking place is going to be on data and reducing health disparities. That subcommittee meeting is taking place on Thursday, September 22nd from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. I again want to reiterate that I know the timings of these meetings might feel a little wonky to some people, but we did hear feedback from task force members that we need to have some variability in timing. Hence the late timing of this meeting, the early timing of the next meeting. So we're trying to just have, you know, as diverse a group of task force members, because we know that not every task force member can make every meeting. Ian, go ahead.
I was just curious, this is more for the community, but how is the feedback coming in? Are we seeing equal amount of comments we saw last time? I had such a good time reading them on the bus to Grand Junction, and I'm just curious if we're on track, and how the outreach is going, I guess.
Yeah, Joel or Morgan, I don't know if you've, Joel, I can tell that you're checking. I can see you like, you're probably clicking around to see exactly how many public comments we're receiving. But I do just want to reiterate that we are offering people to provide public comment via the survey, written feedback in an email, written feedback in the form of public comment and suggested edits, or setting up a one-on-one with us. And so I think we have been receiving some public comment. It may not be as robust as we want it to be right now. And one of the major things that we're going to be doing is Morgan actually is working on kind of like a communications toolkit for all of you task force members. I'll be sending that out to you either, if not tomorrow, on Monday. And that's basically going to be, you know, like crafted Facebook posts or, you know, Twitter posts that you all can send out to ensure that we continue receiving more public comment. We still have 29 days. Our public comment period ends on October 14th. So I just wanted to let you know about next steps, but we'll turn it over to Joel to provide more of an accurate update.
Yeah, I just checked and we have 16 responses to our English survey so far. So obviously not quite close to the 200 we had last time, but it's still early in the period. I think, you know, we'll continue doing pushes, and a lot of times people wait to the last minute. And to Lumna's point, you know, we have done social media, we've done press releases. We're also planning a sort of cafecito style conversation about the recommendations, and Commerce City is currently slated for September 29th, coming up soon, and then something in early October in Pueblo. We almost had a date, and then Rebecca Vigil, our community engagement specialist, got jury duty that day. So we're trying to work around that, but more to come soon. We'll be announcing those in both those communities. And yeah, I think the toolkit will be great because we do need you as task force reps to kind of help us spread the word. Like we know not all the communities that we need to reach are subscribers to our listserv or our folks that we are able to reach through the channels we're using. And so we really hope that toolkit will be helpful. And of course, part of why we did a 45-day comment period was so that, you know, we would have enough time, right? We're 15 days in, but you know, there's still 30 more days to go. So effectively as long as the first comment period. So hopefully that gives us time to keep those outreach and engagement efforts up. And Morgan, do you have a number for how many written comments we've received so far?
I do, and it's actually extremely funny that you bring this up. I was just uploading Chase Janice's comment, who has joined us on these meetings before. She was just able to submit her comment to us via email. At the moment, we only have 9 substantial written comments that have come into our inbox, but they are coming in pretty steadily every day. And so, of course, we can continue our efforts and we'll be pushing even further, but I wanted to provide you with an update.
Thanks for that, and thanks for pulling up those numbers so quickly. So 16 surveys and 9 written comments. And Jamie, I know you had your hand up for a moment and you put it down. So if you don't have anything to share, that's fine. But I wanted to make sure I didn't miss you.
Yeah, I think I kind of answered my own question. Thanks.
Got it. Cool. Well, that is just kind of a early plug to our task force members to please do assist us in getting the word out about public comment. We will send you that comms toolkit likely tomorrow by the latest Monday. And again, those are kind of crafted posts where you can plug those into an email or plug it into a social media post and encourage people to provide public comment. Obviously, the networks that you all are connected to are much broader than just the networks that CDPHE has access to or that us staff have access to. So please do help us in that effort. I think that's all from us. Any other last minute thoughts? Oh, and thank you, Joel, for mentioning that in the chat. That several other agencies, including CEO, APCD, DNR, and others have advertised the common opportunities through their own channels. And also kind of worth noting that we are setting up one-on-one meetings with many of the agencies to get particular feedback from them as well. So, all right, I think that's a wrap. We will go ahead and close a little early. I'm sure everybody's going to look forward to having the evening time back. Thanks so much, and look forward to seeing many, if not all of you, at the next subcommittee meeting next Thursday, September 22nd, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. For the Data and Reducing Health Disparities Subcommittee. Oh, sorry, Jamie.
Thanks, Lubna. Sorry to be last minute with this. I was just kind of chatting with Joel, and I didn't realize that the Pueblo meeting was going to happen before the end of public comment. So if there's anything we can help specifically with outreach, please feel free to reach out. We're always happy to help with that.
I will take you up on that. Thank you, Jaime. Yeah, I'll send you an email right now, actually.
Awesome. All right. Thanks all. Have a good night.